They locked him in a cell with wild foxwomen. Days later, they found them snuggled tenderly on his chest.
The thawing of hearts. Morning came slowly to the deep sanctum, marked only by a slight change in the quality of darkness. Kale woke to find the bread pieces gone and 3 pairs of eyes watching him from varying distances. Cythera had moved closer during the night, her coils arranged in a less defensive position. Velena remained in the middle ground, observing. Riska stayed pressed against the far wall, but her head was raised, attentive. "Good morning," Kale said softly, as though greeting friends rather than captors. He stretched carefully, mindful not to make sudden movements. His healer's eyes noticed details others might miss, the way Cythera's tail bore a deep gash that hadn't healed properly, how Velena's scales were dull from malnutrition, the countless scars crisscrossing Riska's crimson coils. The guards came once daily, sliding a tray of meager rations through a slot in the door, watery soup, stale bread, sometimes a piece of dried fruit. Kale waited until they left, then approached the tray slowly. He divided everything into 4 equal portions, though his stomach cramped with hunger. "May I come closer?" he asked, looking at Cythera's wounded tail. "That injury looks painful." She hissed, but didn't strike. Taking this as permission, Kale moved forward incrementally, his hands visible and empty. When he reached her, she tensed, every muscle coiled to attack. But Kale simply knelt, examining the wound from a respectful distance. "It's infected," he said quietly. "Without treatment, it will only worsen." He tore a strip from his already tattered shirt, then looked around the cell. In the corner, water seeped through the stone into a small depression. He soaked the cloth, wrung it out, and turned back to Cythera. "This will hurt at first," he warned, "but then it will feel better, I promise." Something in his voice, perhaps the absolute sincerity, perhaps the gentleness that expected nothing in return, made Cythera slowly uncoil her tail. Her copper scales rippled as she extended the wounded section toward him. Kale worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound with the cold water. Cythera flinched but didn't pull away. Her fangs remained bared, but her eyes began to soften. When he finished, he bound the wound with another strip of cloth, his fingers careful not to linger or presume intimacy. "There," he said, sitting back. "Change this daily if you can. The cold water here is actually quite clean." Velena had drifted closer during this exchange, fascinated by the care he showed. That night, as cold seeped up from the stone floor, Kale began to sing, old lullabies his mother had taught him, songs of starlight and summer meadows, of gentle rains and growing things. His voice wasn't trained, but it carried warmth. The serpent women had never heard such sounds. In their years of captivity, they'd known only harsh commands, the clash of weapons, the screams of the punished. This was different, music that asked nothing, that simply existed as a gift. Riska's trembling slowed. Velena's coils loosened from their perpetual defensive curl. Cythera, emboldened by the successful treatment of her wound, moved closer still, until only a few feet separated her from where Kale sat against the wall. "Why?" Velena finally spoke, her voice rusty from disuse, the word barely a whisper. "Why do you show us kindness?" Kale smiled, though his eyes held sadness. "Because you're alive, because you feel pain and fear, hunger and cold. What other reason does kindness need?" The serpent women had no answer. They'd been called monsters, beasts, creatures without souls. They'd been told they existed only to serve or to suffer. No one had ever suggested they deserved kindness simply for existing. That night, as Kale sang softly in the darkness, Velena moved closer. She didn't touch him, but she settled within the sound of his voice, letting it wash over her like warm water. Cythera tested her newly dressed wound and found the pain significantly lessened. Even Riska uncurled slightly, though she remained against the far wall. The walls of fear were beginning to crack. Trust, that most fragile and precious thing, was taking its first tentative breaths in the darkness of the deep sanctum.
forbidden tenderness. Days blended into one another in the timeless dark, but something remarkable was unfolding. Cythera's wound healed cleanly under Kael's attentive care, and she began to seek his presence, her copper coils often arranged near where he sat. Velena started speaking more, her voice growing stronger as she shared fragments of her past, memories of forests above ground, of moonlight on water, of freedom before the chains. Kael listened to every word as though it were precious, which to him it was. He never interrupted, never dismissed their pain with empty platitudes. He simply bore witness, and in doing so, helped them carry burdens they'd borne alone for too long. It was Velena who first initiated deeper contact. During one particularly cold night, when their breath misted in the frigid air, she approached where Kael sat, wrapped in his thin tunic. Without a word, she began to work her fingers through his dark hair, which had grown long and tangled during his imprisonment. "Among my kind," she said softly, her fingers gentle and precise, "we braid the hair of those we trust, those we care for." She separated his hair into sections, weaving them with a skill that spoke of muscle memory and cultural tradition. "I have not done this since—" She didn't finish, but Kael understood. "It's an honor," he said quietly. "Thank you." The intimacy of the gesture was not lost on any of them. Cythera watched with fascination, her own copper hair falling in wild waves around her shoulders. Riska, still keeping her distance, had begun moving closer during Kael's songs, drawn despite herself to the warmth he radiated. One evening, Cythera broke her usual silence with a story. She spoke of her childhood, of learning to hunt in crystalline caves, of a mother who taught her that strength and gentleness were not opposites, but complements. Her voice cracked when she described the day soldiers came, declaring serpent women a threat to be contained. "They said we were monsters," she whispered, her scales rippling with emotion, "that we couldn't feel, couldn't love, couldn't be trusted. They beat us until we became what they expected, until we learned that kindness was weakness and trust was suicide." Kael reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement. When she didn't pull away, his hand found hers, not quite human, not quite serpent, but warm and real. "You are not what they made you," he said firmly. "You are what you choose to be. And I see strength, intelligence, and courage. I see beings worthy of respect and care." Cythera's eyes glistened in the dim light. Then, in a moment that seemed to surprise even herself, she moved forward and rested her head against his shoulder. Her powerful body, capable of crushing stone, became gentle against him. Kael wrapped his arm around her carefully, offering warmth and safety. It was then that Riska made her choice. The smallest and most wounded of the three, she had watched this unfolding connection with longing and terror. But Kael's acceptance of Cythera, his unhesitating embrace, broke something open inside her. She approached slowly, her crimson scales catching the faint light like embers. When she reached them, she didn't speak. Words were still too difficult, too dangerous. Instead, she curled her coils near Kael's other side and, with trembling courage, rested her scarred head against his chest. Kael's heart beat steady and strong beneath her ear, a rhythm of life and acceptance. He moved his free hand to rest gently on her head, his touch asking nothing, offering everything. Velena, having finished braiding his hair, settled against his back, her silver scales cool against the thin fabric of his tunic. The four of them sat like this, a configuration that would have seemed impossible days before, connected by warmth, by choice, by the radical act of trust. "I hear your heart," Riska whispered, so quietly Kael almost missed it. "It's kind." "So is yours," he replied, feeling the truth of it. "All of yours." The discovery. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once. Cythera began teaching Kale the serpent tongue, the hissing, melodic language of her people. She would press close to him, her lips near his ear, repeating words until he could approximate the sounds. The lessons were intimate, filled with laughter when he got it wrong and gentle praise when he succeeded. Velena discovered that Kale's skin bore old scars, marks from his own suffering before this imprisonment. One night she traced them with her fingertips, her touch feather-light, mapping his pain the way he'd witnessed theirs. "These hurt you," she said softly. "Once," Kale admitted, "but pain fades. What we learn from it remains." Riska had become bold enough to sleep fully draped across him, her powerful coils wrapped loosely around his waist, her head always over his heart. She spoke more now, sharing dreams she'd thought dead, of sunshine, of open spaces, of being seen as something other than a threat. The cell had become something unexpected, not a prison, but a sanctuary. They shared everything: food, warmth, stories, touch. Boundaries that seemed essential at first had dissolved into something more fluid, more trusting. Kale would wake to find himself entwined with scaled limbs, surrounded by warmth, and feel more at peace than he ever had in the world above. It was during a storm that the guards came. Thunder rolled through the earth itself, making the walls tremble. The four of them had huddled together for comfort. Kale in the center, the three serpent women arranged around and against him like living artwork. Cythera's head rested on his chest, her copper scales warm against his skin. Velena had her hand clasped in his, their fingers intertwined as she pressed against his side. Riska was curled in his lap, her crimson coils loose and trusting, her breathing finally peaceful. The door opened with a crash. Warden Thorn stood there, flanked by guards with weapons drawn. They'd come expecting to find Kale's boons, picked clean by the supposedly feral creatures. They'd anticipated blood and carnage, justification for their cruelty. Instead, they found a scene so tender it seemed to belong in a painting rather than a prison cell. Kale sat calmly against the wall, his dark eyes meeting the warden's without fear. The three serpent women, who should have been isolated, aggressive, untouchable, were draped across him in various states of peaceful repose. There was no violence, no fear, only the quiet intimacy of beings who had found safety in each other. "Impossible," Warden Thorn breathed, his face draining of color. "They're monsters. They attack anyone who approaches. We've lost 3 guards to them." "Perhaps," Kale said quietly, his hand gently stroking Cythera's hair as she began to wake. "They were defending themselves against monsters." Cythera lifted her head, her fangs baring instinctively at the intruders. Velena and Riska stirred, their bodies tensing, but Kale's gentle touch on each of them kept them from striking. "It's all right. You're safe. I won't let them hurt you." The warden stared at this impossible tableau. Behind him, guards whispered in shock. One, younger than the others, lowered his weapon slightly. "Sir, if he can calm them, what if we were wrong?" "Silence," Thorn snapped, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "You there, healer, what sorcery is this?" Kale smiled sadly. "No sorcery, just kindness, just seeing them as they truly are, not the monsters you made them into, but the intelligent, feeling beings they've always been." "This changes nothing," the warden declared, but his voice wavered. "You're still a prisoner. They're still dangerous." "Then why," Kale asked, his hand gently stroking Cythera's hair as she began to wake, "why do after days locked together, do we look like this rather than how you expected?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Finally, Thorn backed out of the cell, slamming the door. But Kale had seen something shift in the man's eyes. Doubt, perhaps the first crack in the foundation of cruelty this place was built upon. As the footsteps retreated, Cythera looked up at Kale.
what happens now? Now, he said, pulling all three of them closer, we wait, and we trust that truth has a way of rising even from the darkest depths.